can you use beer yeast to ferment a distillation wash? The answer is yes. The real question is, should you? How's it going, chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. I'm Jesse, this is Still It, and yes, you totally can use brewer's yeast to ferment a distilling wash. At the end of the day, any Saccharomyces yeast, any yeast that is going to take sugar and turn it into carbon dioxide and alcohol is usable, because of course the mission, the point of fermenting stuff for us as distillers is to create alcohol. But is it desirable? Is it worthwhile? A few things to think about. That's what this video is all about. First of all, let's talk about the economics, the cost of brewer's yeast versus distiller's yeast. Generally, for distiller's yeast, it's pretty easy, if you're going to be able to find it, to get it in 500 gram blocks like this. And generally, it's pretty damn cost effective. So we sell these on the website, and I believe it's between like $29 and $36 at the moment, New Zealand, for a pack of angel yeast, 500 grams. Brewer's yeast, on the other hand, tends to come in these little 9 to 12 gram packs. And as a comparison, it's generally about 5 or 6 of these will cost about the same as one of these. So you're literally getting 10 times as much yeast in terms of bang for buck buying distiller's yeast. Obviously, of course, there's going to be people that will do starters, and throwing rubbish around all over the place, do starters and grow it up themselves. Obviously, there'll be people that have hookups with kind of commercial suppliers, and they can buy 500 gram or kilo blocks if they're using a bunch of it. Obviously, there's also going to be people that just have brewer's yeast laying around. So I just wanted to mention the economics of it first to kind of put this all in perspective for you. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention at this point in time, baker's yeast. Baker's yeast is generally the cheapest yeast you can get that is serviceable for distilling. Maybe not entirely artistically the best choice all the time. If you go to whatever store your local restaurant buys its supplies from, for us it's Gilmore's or Toops in New Zealand, you're going to be able to get a 500 gram block of baker's yeast for cheaper than distiller's yeast. Moving on. The next point is the alcohol tolerance of the yeast itself. A lot of beer yeasts only go to 6 to 8% ABV. Now that's not a be-all end-all big issue, because there is a bunch of beer yeasts that'll ferment up to, the 12 to 14% range. Think of Russian Imperial stouts, barley wines, dirty great big beers that get up into the wine sort of territory in ABV. There are select strains that will do that, but it's just something to mention if you're thinking about playing with yeast. Think about the ABV tolerance of the yeast and whether or not that's really going to give you what you want in terms of kind of economy of scale on how you're going about things and how many runs you'll have to do, so on and so forth. There'll be a number listed on the yeast packet itself or on the spec sheet that comes with the yeast or on the website or whatever it is. You're looking for something like alcohol tolerance. This is actually a cider yeast and it goes up to 17.5%. Not an issue with this one. It is also worth noting in this kind of logistics focused part of the video that a lot of beer yeasts will have a lower temperature window listed for the yeast itself. Now, in my experience and opinion, often you can push this a little bit higher. So if a yeast says it'll ferment between, let's say 12 and 20 degrees Celsius, you can probably push that for distilling purposes up to 22, 23, maybe even 25 degrees Celsius without too much concern. Keep in mind that when you're using it as a beer, you are drinking everything. You don't get to clean it up later on with distillation. So the beer guys are really focused on having a very clean, pleasant ester contribution from the fermentation. As distillers, we can push that a little bit, but still, often the temperature window will be lower. So if your temperature conditions are higher, or you just like fermenting at a higher temperature, up closer to 30 degrees Celsius for whatever reason, keep that in mind as well. This next point is probably one of the things I would most strongly consider when deciding whether or not to use a beer yeast or a new beer yeast I haven't used before for distilling. When you distill, you're boiling the crap out of everything in the pot. And inevitably, you're going to have yeast cells in that pot as well. Obviously, a varying degree of yeast cells, depending on how clear the wash is before you put it into the still. I guess we can think of it on a scale of, on one end, we've crash cooled and used finings, and the wash is crystal freaking clear, kind of like we would treat a lot of beers. On the way other end of the scale is bourbon, where we're distilling on grain and all of the yeast, pretty much, except maybe a little yeast cake at the bottom, is going into the pot. The more yeast you have in the pot, the more likely this is to be an issue. But the general idea is that some yeasts, when you boil the crap out of them and the cell walls rupture and the cell kind of falls apart, they release a disgusting autolysis-like flavor into the spirit. And that does not taste good. It's a flavor that's kind of like semi-rotting meat, rancid Marmite or Vegemite. It isn't good. You don't want it in your spirits. Some yeasts, on the other hand, they can actually release a desirable flavor when you boil the crap out of the yeast cell. And generally, for distilling, distillers have selected for the latter, or at least something that doesn't taste bad. Now, because brewing yeasts don't have to take this into consideration, you run the risk, potentially, of getting something that doesn't taste great if you get too much yeast into the pot. I don't want to turn this into a big boogeyman thing. I've distilled with beer yeasts in the past. What are the SO2, Kvike, and I can't remember the Belgian strain I used. Sorry, don't remember. And none of them were particularly terrible on this front. But I have heard stories, I have heard people report that it does happen if you pick the wrong yeast. Just wanted to let you guys know. By the way, team, we finally have hoodies, CTC hoodies that are actually good, that we actually like. Aaron won the fight, the Patreons will know about this, with the big, heavy, slouchy kind of hoodie versus the thinner, more fitted hoodie. Aaron won, we've gone with the comfort hoodie. We only have samples at the moment, and for that reason, there's like 25 of these things available in New Zealand right now. We wanted to get at least 25 of them to make sure the quality was good across all of them, and to see if you guys like them. So if you're into them and you're keen on them, we'll order more and get them to America as well. But for now, there's 25 of these things available just out of the New Zealand store. So if you're in New Zealand or Australia, you can pick one up if you want to. They're on the website. If you're in America and you'd be keen to get one of these, let us know down below, because honestly, it's kind of a large financial investment to get 100 or 200 of these made. Anyway, now that we've got through the boring logistics stuff for distilling with brewer's yeast, let's talk about the fun part, which is, and I have to imagine if you've made beer before, you're thinking this already as well, the giant, huge gamut of flavors that can be produced by different yeasts. And the brewing world has a much larger range of flavors that can be produced from yeasts, I think, than the distilling world traditionally. And that's exciting because there's a lot more untapped, unexperimented with, untried flavors that could potentially go into our spirits. I think that's exciting. Like I said, I've tried Kvike. That was very interesting. It gave a almost like fruit leather, fruit roll-up flavor to the spirit, which was delicious. I need to do that again. SO2, an English ale yeast, it definitely added like a soft stone fruit, orchard fruit kind of flavor that was similar to the Scotch fermentation profile, but significantly different to it. And the third one that I at least remember trying was a Belgian yeast, and it wasn't a big banana bomb Belgian, it was more of a spicy clove, and that imparted flavors across as well. But here's the thing, just because a yeast creates flavors doesn't necessarily mean that those flavors will carry over into the final spirit. So we're kind of into the experimental realm here, right? The other issue is that just because those flavors carry over into the spirit, and they're there coming off the still, doesn't mean they're going to stick around for a week, for a month. Maybe they just kind of dissipate, evaporate, vanish while the bottle sits. And I think this is definitely worth thinking about if you're planning on aging for long periods of time. So specifically that fruit note that came from the SO2, that did seem to dissipate a little bit for me over time while aging. And I've heard reports of other people saying this in the commercial world, saying that it tasted amazing for about 8 to 12 months. And then that flavor just kind of poof, disappeared in the barrel. Once again, this isn't a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing. It's something to experiment with. Just because that happens with SO2 doesn't mean it happens with other things. Just because it happened, or I perceived it to happen for me with SO2 doesn't mean it'll happen for you. Maybe there's a way to negate that, to work around it. Maybe you ferment hotter. Maybe you get the idea. I think it's also worth mentioning that whenever you're pushing the boundaries a little bit, and playing with new ingredients, new processes, sometimes things can be perceived positively or negatively because of the fact they're different, not on their own merit. And that's not people being nasty, it's just the way people think. Some people think of, if this is the sphere of generally known flavors for, let's talk about single malt, right? Anything that's outside of that, that's too far outside of it, is automatically labeled as yuck. Because I haven't experienced that before. It's strange. It's not single malt. That means bad. Other people have this fear of known flavors for whatever, bourbon, and something's way out here, off screen. It's so far removed from what bourbon normally is that they go, holy crap, this is exciting and delicious. They don't even really think about what it tastes like. It's just new and exciting. Those are the two extremes, but I just wanted to mention it because, especially when we're experimenting and trying new things, I know I do this too. And I can be on either end of that spectrum. I don't know, depending on what it is I'm making and depending on my mood for the day, I guess. So just be aware that when you're throwing a flavor that is not generally perceived as being part of a spirit, I think maybe going like 1 degree of weird at a time is good. A huge shout out and thank you to the Patreons, being the people that support us day in, month out, and specifically because the topic of this video popped up in one of the Q&A sessions, and I thought it was something that probably more than just that one person was thinking about. So thanks to the Patreons. I will see you next time on the next Q&A. The post is already up. Drop your questions there. So, in summary, hell yes, you can distill with brewer's yeast. Keep in mind the alcohol tolerance, the temperature, the whether or not it's going to throw weird autolysis notes. You're just going to have to experiment with that. Keep those things in mind. Try some weird and wacky stuff. Crowbar in some different flavors, some different esters into spirits you know and love, or just go full send and do new everything and see what happens. Honestly, it's the reason I love this hobby. There's so many things to experiment with. So I hope some of you are going to go out and experiment with brewer's yeast. I'll catch you next time, guys. Keep chasing the craft. See ya.